is a saying which is very pertinent to my talk, which goes as follows. Women set the table and clean the table, but have neither a seat nor a say at the table when key decisions are reached. I think this is very pertinent to what I want to say, what the message I want to leave with you. And of course, our aim remains to achieve gender equality in decision-making and to render obsolete this particular saying. First, I will talk about the relationship between gender equality and democracy. I referred earlier to the percentage of women worldwide. It's on the average is about 50-50. In some cases, it's above 50%. In some other cases, it's below 50%. But on the average, is 50-50. So this half of the world needs to be able to participate in the decisions that are taken in their countries, in their societies, in the world. So worldwide, there is an underrepresentation of women in decision-making. For democratic institutions and processes to have legitimacy, integrity, and also to be able to respond to the interests, but also to the concerns of all citizens, they must be inclusive, so they have to include the plurality of groups in society. So all groups in society need to be represented in decision-making. And of course, the empowerment of women and the establishment of gender equality are very, very crucial and very essential to every democracy. Central to the pursuit of democracy are policies and practices that seek to increase the participation, the representation, the leadership, and the decision-making of women in politics, and to reduce inequalities between men and women in all spheres of life. As I said earlier, women worldwide, of course, we have some bright exceptions, and one of them, of course, is Iceland, is a leader in gender equality worldwide, and I'm very proud to have been associated at some point of my life with Iceland, and the way I am today, to a great extent, is because of Iceland and the rest of the Nordic countries. My philosophy, my perception of life got a lot from my experience with Iceland, and thank you for that. The absence of women from political life results in democratization with a male face. So it's a male face of democracy in many parts of the world. So it's an incomplete democracy. Now we'll see here, we have 23 countries from the 193 countries in the world, members of the United Nations. We have 133 countries, 93 countries, 23 only, which makes 11.9% only, are led by women. So women presidents or women prime ministers. And I'm talking only about elected officials, not appointed. So I exclude queens or other governors or other non-elected officials. So these 23 women are either presidents or prime ministers of their countries. The majority come from Europe, and you will see there from Romania, Germany, Lithuania, Norway, Malta, Croatia, UK, Estonia, Serbia, Iceland, and Georgia, who is assuming the presidency of Georgia today. So she's becoming the president of Georgia today. We have also 5 from Asia, Bangladesh, Nepal, Myanmar, Taiwan, and Singapore. We have 2 from Africa, only 2 from Africa, and this is Namibia and Ethiopia. We have 1 from Latin America proper, which is Peru. And then we have Marshall Islands, New Zealand, Trinidad and Tobago, and Barbados. So if we talk about underrepresentation of women in leadership, this is a very good example. Only 11.9% in the world, worldwide, of countries are represented by women leaders. Let's have a better view now of legislature. In parliaments in the world, and these statistics are from the Interparliamentary Union, worldwide, only 24% of members of parliament are women. Again, 1/4 only of members of parliament worldwide are women. Leaders, again, in this sector are the Nordic countries with 42.3%. I'm sure in Iceland it's nearly 50% of members of parliament are women. In Europe, including Nordic countries, and when we talk about Europe, in this particular case, we talk about OSCE countries, 27.8%. In Europe, excluding Nordic countries, it is 26.4%. In Sub-Saharan Africa, 23.7%. In Asia, 19.8%. In Arab countries, in general, 18.6%, and in the Pacific, 15.6%. So again, we see in the majority of countries is only 1/4 of the members of parliament are women. Now, when we go to presiding officers of parliaments, again, the situation is not that good. Out of 279 posts of presiding officers, and this is more than 193 countries, because many countries, they have bicameral legislatures, so they have the upper and the lower house of parliament. So in all presiding officers, we have only 19.4% who are presiding officers of parliaments worldwide. Now, when we come to cabinets, when we come to ministerial positions, the situation is also different in different countries. We have only 6 countries worldwide that women ministers are more than 50%. One of them is Iceland, if I'm not mistaken. We have countries like Canada, we have in France. So 6 countries worldwide, they have 50 to 52% women ministers. Another 6 countries, they have 40 to 49.9%. And then the list goes on until we have 13 countries in the world that have no female ministers at all. So this is a very representative, and this is again from the Interparliamentary Union most recent statistics, which is October of 2017. Now, more interesting is when we look at the different portfolios that women ministers hold. And you will see that the vast majority, which is 54% of women ministers, and this is the lower down, 54% hold portfolios related to social, human rights, environment, education, culture, health, sports, women's affairs, and family. So the majority of women ministers are appointed in fields which are more so-called women issues or human rights issues or social issues. Then we have 22.2% of women ministers who hold portfolios related to trade, research and development, public works, agriculture, tourism, communication, postal affairs, and so on. Then we have 7.4% who hold portfolios related to public administration, local government, population, parliamentary affairs, information, and media. 5.8% hold portfolios related to home and justice affairs, and in this particular portfolio we have police affairs as well. So only 5.8% of ministers hold these portfolios. And then 5.9% hold portfolios related to foreign affairs and defense. And only 3.07% hold portfolios related to finance, budget, economy, and development. So when decisions are taken in a cabinet, let's say worldwide, about these very important issues, which is budget, how the budget of a country is distributed, how development projects are implemented, the decisions in their vast majority are taken by men. Now, when we look at corporate boards worldwide, this is an area also that women are very represented. Overall, worldwide, only 12% of seats are held by women in corporate boards, and only 4% chairmen of boards are women. Nevertheless, it has been proven by research all around the world, especially by IMF, by World Bank, by the World Economic Forum and other organizations, that female presence and involvement on boards improves the firm's importance and performance, transforms corporate governance, and leads to the transition towards more responsible business. Also, research has shown that greater board and leadership diversity has very big benefits for companies as far as the outcome and profitability of those businesses. And the representation of women on corporate boards continues to increase, but the number of women leading boards still remains very low globally. And this is a map that you can see very well that the green and the yellow, it's not a very good representation, but the green and the yellow is primarily in the Nordic countries, which is 22.6% and above. So only a very small number of countries, they have these very high percentages of women in corporate boards. And the vast majority of the countries have neither no women at all in the corporate boards or very low representation of women. Now we'll go to the other topic. Of course, there is a lot to say more about democracy and gender equality, but because of the limited time, I will restrict myself to what I have said already, and I hope that during the question and answer section we can say more. But I will say a few things about the gender equality and peace, because this is also an area where women are almost totally absent. And when we talk about women and peace, we talk about women's representation in peace negotiations, in peace building, in peacekeeping, and when decisions are taken globally about peace and security, women are almost totally absent. Now, we'll see some basic facts and basic truths. The higher levels of gender equality are associated with a lower propensity for conflict, both between and within states. Women's participation in conflict prevention and resolution can improve outcomes before, during, and after conflict. And this has all been proven by empirical research. Women's participation in all tracks of diplomacy, and especially in peace negotiations, remains of paramount importance. First and foremost, there is a need to include all talents and all perspectives, including gender perspectives, in the efforts to resolve conflicts. And finally, incorporating the perspectives and accommodating the needs of the wider population, including women, increases the prospects for the peace agreements to be adopted by large majorities. So it's not important only to conclude agreements. What is important is to include the concerns and the interests of all participants in that conflict, especially women and youth, and this is something that the UN is very strongly proposing, to include women and civil society in general in all peace negotiations, so that all these perspectives are included in the agreement, but also in order to make these agreements more to be embraced by the population in general, and to have them adopted by large majorities. But this is unfortunately the situation that we see in most peace negotiations. Very few women and mostly men. Let's see now some more facts and figures. During the period from 1990 to the year 2000, and I'll come back to that because in October of 2000, there was a major breakthrough, the adoption of a very important resolution by the UN Security Council. Probably some of you know about this resolution. Is Resolution 1325 of 2000 about women, peace, and security. Now, before that, between 1990 and 2000, only 11% of peace agreements included at least one reference to women. Later on, after the adoption of Resolution 1325 in the year 2000, out of 504 agreements signed since the adoption of that resolution, only 138, that is 27%, included references to women. So we have an increase, but still only 27% of all these agreements that have been signed made any references to women. In 2015, 7 out of 10 peace agreements signed included gender-specific provisions. So we have a gradual incorporation of women's issues and women's concerns in peace agreements because of the adoption of this very important resolution. As I said earlier, the participation of civil society groups, including women's organizations, makes a peace agreement 64% less likely to fail. And this has been proven by a lot of cases that the UN and other international bodies have been researching. And of course, when women participate in peace processes, whenever this happens, the resulting agreement is 35% more likely to last at least 15 years. So in most of the cases which have not taken on board concerns of all groups of the population, there are failures, there are regression, and they go back into conflict. So here we can see a very interesting also lack of representation of women. Only 2% are chief mediators worldwide. Only 4% are witnesses and signatories of peace agreements, and only 9% worldwide are negotiators. Now, the only two women in history up to now that have served as chief negotiators are these two women. The one is Tzipi Livni of Israel. Between 2013 and 2014, she was chief negotiator of Israel in the peace negotiations. And Miriam Coronel Ferrer of the Philippines. She was also chief negotiator of the Philippines in the peace negotiations. And Miriam is the only woman that has ever signed a final peace accord as chief negotiator. So this says a lot about the situation of women in peace negotiations. And again here, very good representation. Only 4 women are participating in peace negotiations. I mentioned earlier here is also a very good example, a room with only men, and this is one of the conferences on Syria, 2015 December. All representatives around the table are men, not a single woman sitting around the table. I mentioned earlier Resolution 1325, which is a very landmark decision of the Security Council on Peace, Women, Peace and Security. I will just say a few words about these resolutions and its importance. It's the first time that the UN Security Council addressed the disproportionate and unique impact of armed conflict on women. It's the first time also that there is a recognition of the undervalued and underutilized contributions of women that they make to conflict prevention, peacekeeping, conflict resolution, and peace building. And also it's the first time that the UN Security Council stressed the importance of women's equal and full participation as active agents in peace and security. Now, what happened since the adoption of this resolution? These are some of the key elements of this resolution. What happened since 2000? 18 years since the adoption of this resolution, which highlighted the need for women's participation in all aspects of peacekeeping, peacemaking, and peace building. Formidable political, socio-cultural, and economic obstacles remain to the full participation of women in peace efforts, whether as peacemakers or as citizens. Only very marginal progress has been made with regard to the number of women in formal peace negotiations. A limited number of provisions addressing women's human rights and concerns have been incorporated in peace agreements, and gender equality remains a fundamental global governance challenge, especially in conflict-affected environments. Now we'll see 3 very bright examples. We see the 3 women who were awarded with the Nobel Peace Prize. This is in 2011, the 10th of December of 2011. These 3 women were awarded equally the Nobel Peace Prize. 2 of them are from Liberia, the former president of Liberia, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, and the Liberian peace activist Layman Bowie, and also the journalist from Yemen, Tawakkul Karman. And let me say a few words about what the Nobel Peace Committee had to say about these women. First of all, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf was Africa's first democratically elected female president. Throughout her presidency from 2006 to 2018, she contributed to securing peace in Liberia, to promoting economic and social development, and to strengthening the position of women. Leyman Bowie is a Liberian peace activist who mobilized and organized women across ethnic and religious dividing lines to bring an end to the long war in Liberia and to ensure women's participation in elections. She has since worked to enhance the influence of women in West Africa during and after war. And the third one, the Yemeni journalist Tawakkul Karman, in the most trying circumstances, both before and during the Arab Spring, this Yemeni journalist has played a leading part in the struggle for women's rights and for democracy and peace in Yemen. And I will read one extract from the Norwegian Nobel Committee. The Norwegian Nobel Committee has decided that the Nobel Peace Prize for 2011 is to be divided in 3 equal parts between Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, Leyman Bowie, and Tawakkul Karman for their non-violent struggle for the safety of women and for women's rights to full participation in peace-building work. We cannot achieve democracy and lasting peace in the world unless women obtain the same opportunities as men to influence developments at all levels of society. In October 2000, the UN Security Council adopted Resolution 1325. The resolution, for the first time, made violence against women in armed conflict an international security issue. It underlined the need for women to become participants on an equal footing with men in peace processes and in peace work in general. Let me say that in my country, where we have an ongoing problem for the past 44 years, I'm not going to go into the the history of that problem, but let me tell you that in our case, in the Greek Cypriot negotiating team, I am the only woman in the negotiating team of our side, and this is a disgrace. I have to tell you, but this is the image, and this is the situation worldwide, and we need to change it. And I will conclude with the words of the Secretary General, who says, and I'm proud that we have such a Secretary General. He's proud to be a feminist, and he achieved a lot during his tenure so far. He achieved, first of all, 50% of women in the managerial top level of the UN Secretariat. So this feminist Secretary General has said very recently that by building equality, we give women a chance to fulfill their potential. And we also build more stable societies. Women's participation in decision-making makes peace agreements stronger, societies more resilient, and economies more vigorous. Conversely, attacks on the fundamental rights of women and girls can be precursors to radicalization and violent extremism. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for your informative and illuminating talk. It was interesting to see the statistics and also the relation between gender equality and effects, although we would agree that even if there were no effects, it is a right in itself to establish gender equality. Now, thank you for the kind words about Iceland as well. There are some questions?
Yes.
Yeah, yes.
Yes, I just want to add to this. I'm from Iceland also, so thank you also for the kind words. I'd like to add something about the legal and international legal community. Adding some more statistics. I went 20 years ago from a 34-member May presidencies of the General Assembly of the UN. Adding all of them together from the very beginning.
It is the first time that a woman is presiding the General Assembly.
Four women have been presidents of the General Assembly. None of them, by the way, all of them from the developing world,
None from Europe.
or
Yeah.
Europe. And then, but, so total maybe 15, 16, 17, not this last. The International Criminal Court, as we'll hear hopefully tomorrow, has institutionalized gender representation through the statute and through, so I was very pleased. The last election of the 6 judges elected, 5 were women.
Okay.
Now 1/3 of the court, the criminal court is women. The most hypocrisy I find in the General Assembly, they said 4 out of 72. And when I was in my ministry, I tried to get our minister, our female minister, to propose the General Assembly itself aside from all this lip service in the General Assembly every year, on and on and on, and nonetheless they cannot choose president except once in 20 years. So I wanted them to institutionalize, like in the International Criminal Court, a quota. There will never be more than 2 in a row. So maybe you can help me.
No, I would sign anything you put forward. Definitely.
Hi, I'm Julia, German student. So thank you for outlining so precisely what happens if women aren't participating in politics. I was wondering what your opinion is on laws that ensure the participation of women in politics, or if you think there's a more efficient or a different solution on ensuring female participation in politics.
Yes. I am a very firm supporter of legislative quota, if this is what you're talking about. And it has been very successful. First of all, it's a provision that has already been included in the major convention that was adopted several years ago, the CEDAW Convention, which talks about positive measures to allow more representation of women. And of course, one of the positive measures is quota. As you know, there is a lot of discussion and a lot of argumentation pro and against quota. I am a firm believer in the adoption of legislative quota, and whenever this has been adopted in a number of countries, for example, currently in the European Union, there are 10 or 11 countries that have adopted legislative quota, that have made very important strides of women, increase of women representation in parliaments. So yes, I am very much in favor of legislative quota. There is a worldwide movement that supports this legislative quota in different countries.
Good morning. Thank you for the presentation. I'm Aloysius Tawa from Cameroon. My question is, you made mention of the fact that women are often appointed in position that is women-like. So my question to you is, when a woman is the president, can she appoint Minister of Defense a woman? If you are a president.
Of course I will. First of all, there were many women who were appointed ministers of defense. I will never forget the case of France or the case of Spain. I think she was even pregnant when she was appointed, and there is always this picture, she in front of soldiers, pregnant Minister of Defense. Definitely a female head of state or government has more sensitivity on these particular issues, but of course there are men leaders like the Canadian Prime Minister, for example, Mr. Trudeau, who also very openly says that he's a feminist, that he has appointed 50% of his cabinet women. So not only in these so-called female ministries relating to social, humanitarian, and human rights or family issues, but ministers of defense, ministers of economy, all from all spectrums of society. So, but women leaders are in general more sensitive to these issues, and they have appointed women in all kinds of ministries.
Not the former defense minister, but the former social minister.
Thank you very much for your wonderful speech, and I would like to ask you if we consider the roles of women toward children, toward aged people, disability people, we can consider that the position of women is conform to the needs of 80% of the society. Do you make the link between the crisis of the representative democracy in the world and the low level of representative of women in the position of decision making? And the second question is relative to the gender sensitive budget.
Yeah.
Is there a way to make public policies taking in account the diversity of the
Yes.
population? Do you have an idea about?
Yes, I think it's very important. It's what we call mainstreaming, to have this sense of gender equality and gender sensitivity throughout in all areas that affect decision making in a government, and also to have a specific budget. So all these issues are budgeted, not just theory, but they are budgeted in order to to implement policies and have the right budget allocation for all these policies. And again, I will give the example of the Nordic countries that really are pioneers, they are leaders, they are role models in the world. And if we want really to improve our societies, there is a very simple thing. Look at what the Nordic countries have done, what they have achieved. Of course, we cannot copy what they have done. We have to adapt it to our societies. But they have done remarkable things, and we should always look at their example.
Yes, good morning. Thank you very much for this interesting explanation. I think I've taken pictures of most of your slides. My question is related to how we could improve this advocacy, because unfortunately, often when we are addressing this issue, it is perceived as something that concerns only women. So it's women advocacy for women, interest for women. So what are your views maybe to improve this communication and this advocacy, to include men in the debate, to make them also, I mean, I appreciate that there are many men today, but very often when I am addressing this kind of topics, or when we are raising this kind and debating these things, we realize that the audience is mostly made of women, because we feel concerned, we have a problem, we want to solve it, but we also want to make men understand that it's also their problem.
Yes.
And they have to be part of the solution. So what are your ideas?
Very true, very true. What you have said is very true, and it reflects really the crust of the problem, that in most cases, these issues are considered women's issues, and very few men are involved in the discussion of this issue. There is an international movement, I don't know if you are aware of it, again, it was initiated by Nordic countries, He for She. And this is a movement that has a presence at the United Nations. There are conferences being held globally, men supporting gender equality. So I'm making a plea to all the men. I don't know if the issue of the conference was the role of women, if we would have so many men in this room. I doubt it personally, but I urge all men in this room to to be very strong advocates of gender equality, because as I said in my speech, gender equality is all about democracy. Gender equality is all about economic development. You cannot have economic development in a country if half of the population is not taken into account, if the talents of half of the population are not taken on board. So if we really want to have economic development, if we want to have democracy, if we want to have peace, a sustainable peace and development, we have to take women on board. So men are a very important component of this effort. And of course, unless you have feminist leaders, male leaders, like Mr. Trudeau, for example, like the Secretary General and some other leaders around the world, unfortunately, we will not see much progress. I see it from my country, for example, that we are very there is a very small representation of women in the cabinet currently. At some point we were 25%, now we are only 17% in the cabinet. The same applies also to the parliament. So unless men are a part of this effort and it is not considered as only a woman's issue, we will not see much progress. And of course, women have to be more active, more to mobilize, and to put real pressure in their societies, in their governments, to effect change.
I believe the last question.
Thank you very much. My name is Francisco Gonzalez from the University of Amsterdam. I have a question about the role of women in the aftermath of armed conflict. Because during armed conflict, when the men are going fighting, women in a lot of cases have to take a lot of the responsibilities and therefore emancipate themselves. But when the men come back, they often have to go back to the position in which they were before and kind of lose their right to public space. And for men as well, the violence ends when the conflict is over, but for women it continues because the violence at home is tolerated. So how is it possible to, or is there a solution to this problem? Or do you have any ideas on that?
I'd say we could have a topic of a conference on this particular issue, the role of women in peace building and during and after conflicts. I think that it's extremely important to take on board the problems and the concerns of women during conflict. First of all, the majority of victims are either women and children during conflict, but also after conflict, for the reconstruction of their societies, for rebuilding families that have been separated because of the armed conflict. Women continue to be victimized throughout this process. So, I mean, the solution is always to, as I said, to include women in all peace processes during and after conflict, so that they are able to participate in the decision-making regarding the reconstruction of their societies, and of course to have women decide about the future of their countries after conflict. Okay.
Well, thank you very much.